If asked to tell you about the neighborhood where I've lived for the last 5 years and change, I could tell you it's close to downtown, adjacent to an awesome greenway, occupied by a small coffee shop/pub, or home to some of my favorite people in town. What you might not expect me to tell you, but a fact of which I am no less happy or proud, is that it hosts my city's sole syringe service program, Twin City Harm Reduction Collective, or TCHRC. TCHRC seeks to improve the health and lives and advocate for the rights of people who use drugs in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and surrounding areas. In addition to being a neighbor, I happen to be the pastor of the church that houses TCHRC, Green Street United Methodist Church, where I am right now, and I'm married to one of TCHRC's co-founders. When TCHRC started operating out of the church, neighbors were concerned that having a syringe service program in the neighborhood would increase illegal activity and needle litter. However, studies have shown that the presence of a syringe service program in a neighborhood actually decreases needle litter. And by now, many neighbors appreciate that if they come across discarded drug paraphernalia, they know who to call for its safe disposal. And many of them who have become allies who have accessed naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug, so that they can be of service to family and neighbors themselves. This is a piece of the practical side of what we call harm reduction. And my experience over the last several years as someone connected to this work from a variety of different angles, it has led me to question our assumptions about drug use and the role of faith communities in the lives of people who use drugs. So TCHRC does monthly sweeps of the neighborhood to pick up needle litter, or really all litter, as one way that the program shows its commitment to the well-being of the neighborhood. The last time I went on one of these neighborhood sweeps, a big group of volunteers fanned out and then circled back to the church. And when they returned, they had in hand 11 big bags of trash and 2 syringes. 11 bags of trash, 2 syringes. I have seen people react with outrage over a discarded syringe, despite the fact that serious injury or disease transmission has never been recorded from field contact with the discarded syringe, despite the fact that you cannot overdose from touching fentanyl, the synthetic opioid often cut into or simply sold as heroin, despite the fact that you are far less likely to stumble across a discarded syringe than an empty bag of Doritos tossed in the street. Certainly, folks may not know or realize some of this, but even still, why do we get so angry about one and not the other? From what do we need to get clean? A few years ago, I was visiting a church that wasn't my own, and as the service went on, I got more and more irritated. Every song seemed to be asking God the same thing: wash me, cleanse me, make me clean. And these are strong themes in Scripture, but the songs seemed to be begging for this cleansing in a way that started to get off-putting. And as I thought about why it was bugging me, I thought about how I knew this was a church with a large number of people in recovery, people for whom the word clean meant something very specific to them: sobriety, abstinence, freedom from whatever substance or behavior had caused harm in their lives. I thought about all the people that I know in abstinence-based recovery for whom sobriety has been spiritually and materially transformative. I thought about all the people I know for whom abstinence-based recovery had been presented as their only option, and how the resulting lack of choices caused more harm than it healed. And I thought about how when Jesus told Peter he would wash his feet, and Peter said, "Then wash my head and my hands also," Jesus said, "No, you are already clean." And I thought about how if someone gets clean, it implies they were dirty before. I thought about how the reason we get so much angrier at the person whose litter is a needle than the person whose litter is a chip bag is that we see something more nefarious and somehow less human in their intention or inattention. I thought about how when the Pharisees challenged Jesus and his disregard for purity laws, Jesus told them, "It is not what you put into your body that makes you unclean, but what comes out of your mouth." And I thought about how so often what comes out is stigma and shame and blame. It's not that we don't ever need cleansing. It's that we so often fail to ask the very basic question, from what do we need to get clean? For the last several years, I've volunteered with TCHRC, educated myself on harm reduction, and gotten involved with a national collective called Faith in Harm Reduction. And since I didn't define my terms up front, let me do that now. According to the National Harm Reduction Coalition, harm reduction is both a set of practical strategies aimed at reducing the harm associated with drug use, so things like syringe distribution, naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug, referrals to treatment, HIV and Hep C testing and treatment, housing, etc. But it is also a social justice movement for the rights and dignity of people who use drugs. I married into this movement. My partner is a person with lived experience of substance use and overdose. Harm reduction has saved his life many times and has made it possible for him to get through years of chaotic IV drug use, trauma, and homelessness without fatally overdosing or contracting any of the many infectious diseases that often plague IV drug users. And now he's able to help his community because of that. People who use drugs do not deserve to die or to contract a lifelong illness, and they have so much to offer if only we would give them the chance. To critics questioning the disciples' inattention to purity laws, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 15, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth is what defiles them. Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then goes out into the sewer? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them." What comes out is what defiles, and what is in the heart determines what comes out. We would all do well to examine what is in our hearts when it comes to drugs and the people who use them, and not just in our individual hearts, but in the hearts of our institutions. What is in the heart of our churches and medical establishments, drug policies and criminal justice systems, housing authorities, and more? That determines what comes out. And what comes out has long been deadly to people who use drugs and to communities of color. Brett McCarty is a former seminary classmate of mine who's now doing research at the intersection of theological ethics and population health. He's been working with churches in southwestern Virginia and northeastern Tennessee who want to address overdose and substance use in the Tri-Cities area. Through work with people in recovery and the faith communities that support them, McCarty demonstrates the need for people who use drugs to be converted not necessarily to sobriety, but to embodied agency. And of course, sobriety can be a part of that. On one former drug user's journey, a local church supported her, and what McCarty concluded was that the church, too, needed to be converted from stigma to solidarity. Because here's what happens when we as the church refuse the invitation to that conversion. Overdose rates continue to rise, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, despite the fact that overdose deaths are preventable. When people are ashamed of their drug use and fearful of being discovered, they use alone. And when they use alone, there is no one there to reverse an overdose should it happen. When we refuse to be converted from stigma to solidarity, we perpetuate the lie that people who use drugs are not worth saving, not worth loving, not worth being given real choices. For too long, we have claimed that the only change of heart that needs to happen is in the individual drug user, and rarely by methods that meet a standard of evidence-based care. But so much of the chaos that we blame on drug use is really a product of the war on drugs, which is at its core deeply racist, as we have seen in the far-reaching consequences of mass incarceration. So what might it look like for our faith communities to be converted to solidarity with people who use drugs? It starts with a change in our speech and attitudes toward people who use drugs, with putting away stigmatizing language and whatever else comes out and defiles. For you, it might look like making space for a harm reduction organization in your building, like my church has done, or it might look like asking a local harm reduction group how your church can support their life-saving work. It means working to reduce the harm we cause intentionally or unintentionally to people who use drugs, and that starts with asking ourselves the question, From what do we need to get clean?